The breaking news tonight is that Buckingham Palace has finally confirmed what half of London has been whispering about for weeks. King Charles is stepping back from his public duties, and the power inside the palace is shifting rapidly toward Prince William and Catherine. But that is not the part that is everyone talking. The real story, the one that is currently causing absolute chaos within the highest levels of the royal establishment, is a single, handwritten sentence buried at the bottom of the official succession order. This was not a standard legal phrase drafted by some bureaucrat. It was a deliberate, personal command written by the king himself. A sentence that effectively shut Camilla out of the monarchy's core decision-making process completely. And from what our sources are telling us, she did not see it coming until the document was already signed and sealed. If you have been following the royal family, you know that Charles has been trying to project this image of stability for months. We saw the carefully staged photos of him working at his desk, the endless stream of statements insisting that he was keeping up with his red boxes, the constant assurances that his cancer treatment was not slowing him down. But behind the scenes, the reality was very different. Meetings were being canceled, ceremonies were being shortened, and Prince William was quietly, and perhaps a bit reluctantly, absorbing more and more the king's public schedule. The breaking point, we are learning, happened during a rehearsal for a state ceremony in London. Charles showed up, determined to prove he could still get through it. But witnesses say he physically could not keep up. The color drained from his face, his answers became shorter, and his focus drifted. Eventually, the room had to be cleared and his doctors were called. Their message was blunt. If he did not stop pushing himself, he was going to undo all the progress he had made. He needed to surrender most of his responsibilities immediately and prepare for a longer absence than anyone had publicly admitted. That led to an emergency meeting at Buckingham Palace. William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and a small group of constitutional advisors were summoned without explanation. This was the room where everything changed. Sitting around the table, there was a sealed folder in the center. The title was simple: The Royal Continuity and Succession Order. At first, William assumed it was just about a few canceled engagements, and Catherine thought it was a temporary adjustment to manage the king's health. But then, Charles opened the document and explained what it actually did. It transferred state audiences, senior palace appointments, ceremonial planning, and the long-term direction of the monarchy directly to William. And then he turned to Catherine. Under this order, she would assume responsibilities normally expected of the reigning queen: state banquets, diplomatic receptions, the royal household's public program. Basically, the visible duties that tell Britain and the Commonwealth who is actually at the center of royal life now. Catherine did not respond right away, and honestly, I get it. Accepting a role like that changes how every single future appearance is interpreted. It is one thing to support your husband. It is another to step into a position that makes you look like you are already the queen in waiting. William pushed back too. He told Charles that people might think he forced this transition, that it would look like cold ambition rather than tragic necessity. But Charles was clear. He said the decision was his alone, and that protecting the monarchy could not mean pretending his strength had not changed. He was trying to shield him from the blame, but here is where it gets truly strange. Before the meeting continued, Princess Anne placed a second folder on the table. Inside were confidential notes from members of Camilla's household. These were not just casual emails or water cooler talk. They were detailed plans for how Camilla could preserve her authority if Charles withdrew. These notes described plans for how her office could retain influence over ceremonies, appointments, and the palace program even while William was in charge. They suggested how William's control could be treated as temporary, even if Charles remained away for months. William read the first page twice. Catherine stayed completely still. The implications were impossible to ignore. While Charles was struggling to maintain his duties, Camilla's household was already discussing how to keep power in her hands, and neither William nor Catherine had been invited into those conversations. Charles had not approved them, and had found them through her own channels before the plan could go any further. The language in those notes was careful. Nobody used the word power openly, but every single line pointed in the same direction. Camilla's office had been preparing for Charles's absence before William was even told how serious that absence might become. The proposal described an advisory arrangement based at Clarence House that would allow Camilla's office to review ceremonial plans, recommend changes to the royal diary, and stay deeply involved in state banquets and public appearances. One paragraph actually suggested that William's expanded authority should be described as temporary, even if Charles stayed away for months. That sentence changed the entire tone of the room. William asked who wrote it and pointed to a list of names: senior members of Camilla's office, private secretaries, and household advisors. Charles read the names in silence. He had not approved the meeting. He had not requested the proposal. And he definitely had not been told that his wife's household was already discussing how to preserve influence after he stepped back. Camilla's attention moved to the margins of the document. There were handwritten comments next to proposals, scrawled in an ink that felt far too personal for a constitutional adjustment. One recommendation suggested that major ceremonial decisions should require mandatory consultation with the Queen's office. Another explicitly warned against allowing Kensington Palace to become the only center of authority during the King's recovery. The message underneath all that polite, courtly wording was unmistakable. William could carry the burden of the crown, but Camilla intended to keep a hand on the controls. Princess explained that the papers had reached her after a senior aide became uneasy. The concern was framed as continuity, stability, and experience, the kind of palace language that can make almost anything sound harmless. But Charles closed the folder and asked the question everyone was thinking. Did Camilla know about this? And said the discussions had taken place through her household, but the documents did not reveal how much she had personally approved. William moved toward the door, clearly ready to confront her right there in the hallway. But Charles stopped him. He said this could not become a corridor confrontation, not with staff moving through the palace and reporters watching every change in the royal schedule. Camilla would be summoned privately and given a chance to explain. The meeting broke for 20 minutes. William walked into an adjoining room overlooking the gardens, his anger settling into something colder and more strategic. Catherine followed him, reminding him that the papers were dangerous because they looked reasonable. A public accusation would allow Camilla's office to deny everything and paint William as impatient for crown, a narrative that would be fatal for his future reign. He understood that, and it made his frustration even worse. When Camilla finally entered the room, Charles was seated at the head of the table. The folder closed in front of him. William stood near the fireplace, and Catherine sat directly opposite the chair prepared for Camilla. Nobody raised their voice. The suffocating silence did enough. Charles asked her directly whether her household had discussed an advisory council operating from Clarence House after his withdrawal. Camilla paused, her expression unreadable, and said that her responsible staff had simply considered several possibilities. She described it as preparation, not ambition. She argued that a monarchy facing uncertainty could not afford a discard experience. She reminded them that she had stood beside Charles through years of public pressure, that she understood the diplomatic calendar, the ceremonial machinery, and the personalities inside the royal household. Removing her office from every important decision, she claimed, would not create stability. It would create disruption. Then she made her request. The order should be amended. She proposed a formal position allowing her to retain influence over state banquets, ceremonial appointments, charitable patronages, and the public program. William would manage the constitutional business, and Catherine could represent the crown beside him. But Camilla's household would remain involved whenever tradition, protocol, or the king's interests were concerned. It sounded like a compromise, but it wasn't. Catherine asked one pointed question: who would make the final decision when William and Camilla disagreed? Camilla answered that Charles's wishes should guide them, but that was the very problem. Charles's absence was the entire reason this arrangement existed. Yet, Camilla's proposal still depended on him settling disputes from private rooms while he recovered. The burden would come back to him through calls, competing instructions, and desperate appeals for intervention. And opened the folder and slid one page toward Charles. It described William's authority as reversible. That single word ended the discussion. Charles told Camilla that no amendment would be made that created a second court or weakened the heir's authority. Camilla's expression hardened. She turned to William and asked if this was what he wanted. William answered that he had not written the order. Charles had. Camilla left the room without accepting the decision. The door closed softly behind her, But nobody in that room mistook her calm for surrender. Charles then asked the constitutional advisor the question everyone had been avoiding. Could Camilla's household challenge the order after it was signed? The advisor looked at the final page and said there was one way to ensure they never could. He explained that a transfer of duties could be challenged through interpretation. A household might claim consultation rights, an aide might delay an appointment, or disputed instruction could be returned for clarification. None of those moves would legally overturn William's authority, but each could slow it, weaken it, and force the king back into the struggle he was trying to escape. Charles understood that this was no longer about whether William could carry the workload. It was about whether anyone would be allowed to obstruct him while pretending to protect the crown. William moved away from the fireplace and sat opposite his father. He told Charles that he would not accept authority built on public humiliation. He would not appear before the country as though his father's illness had become an opportunity for a power struggle. If the announcement went forward, it had to preserve the king's dignity. Charles nodded, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had spent years balancing affection, duty, history, and guilt. He told his son that stepping aside was not a surrender. It was a choice made before weakness allowed others to choose for him. Catherine asked how the transition would be presented to the public. Her concern focused on clarity. If William was expected to lead, the public program had to reflect it. If she was expected to assume the Queen's visible duties, no private office could quietly revise her decisions. And watch Charles closely. She knew that every compromise led back to the same problem. Camilla wanted recognition for standing by him. William needed unquestioned authority as heir, and Catherine needed protection from accusations that she had taken something not hers. The monarchy needed one voice, and only one of those needs could govern the order. The advisors began revising the document. Clauses granting consultation rights to the Queen's household were removed. State audiences would pass directly to William. Senior palace appointments would require his approval. Long-term planning would move under his office. Catherine would oversee state banquets, diplomatic receptions, and the ceremonial presentation attached to the royal household, and would remain the bridge, not the ruler, not the rival, but the witness. For nearly an hour, Charles read every line. He asked what would happen if his recovery lasted weeks, then months, then longer than expected. The answers became less comfortable each time. A temporary arrangement could not remain temporary forever simply because no one wished to name what came next. The crown could not live inside a pause. Charles reached the final page. The signature line waited beneath the royal seal. Beside it lay the fountain pen prepared by his private secretary. William expected him to sign. Catherine expected another delay, and noticed his hand move away from the signature line and toward the blank space below the last clause. He began to write, slowly and deliberately. No authority granted through this document may be challenged by the Queen's household. That one sentence changed everything. William read it once, then again. The order was no longer just a medical arrangement. It was a barrier. Charles had not merely transferred responsibility to his son. He had blocked the office most likely to contest how that responsibility would be used. Catherine looked toward Anne, whose stillness revealed that she understood the scale of what had happened. Charles had chosen institutional certainty over private peace, and he had done it in his own handwriting. Typewritten language could be blamed on advisors, but a handwritten sentence from the king could not be dismissed as an administrative misunderstanding. Charles signed beneath the sentence and added his witness. William placed his hand on the document, but did not pick it up for a few seconds. Father and son remained on opposite sides of the table, aware that the paper between them had changed more than the royal diary. It had changed the center of power. A secretary entered, sealed the copies, and asked where the first should be delivered. Charles answered without hesitation. Clarence House. Camilla received it before the announcement was even drafted. She turned the pages, reached the handwritten line, and stopped. Then she called for her staff. The meeting at Buckingham Palace had ended, but the fight over what Charles had signed was only beginning. At Clarence House, Camilla's staff expected anger. What they saw instead was total, chilling control. She placed the copied order on a table and asked each advisor to read the handwritten sentence. No one spoke. The words were too direct. They left no space for negotiation, no quiet route back into palace decisions, and no chance to claim that William's authority remained dependent on her approval. Camilla asked whether the sentence could be softened before the announcement. Her legal advisor answered carefully. The king had written it himself. The seal had been applied and had witnessed the signature. Any attempt to alter the wording would require Charles to reopen the order. Camilla understood the problem. Charles had closed the door before she could even reach it. Her private secretary suggested that she appear beside him anyway, arguing that a united image might preserve the influence the document had removed. Camilla rejected the idea. Standing beneath palace cameras while William and Catherine were presented as the new center of the monarchy would look like consent. Worse, it would make her a witness to her own exclusion. She would not give them that picture.